Hello, this is a quick look at why In a Continental Mood is a good tune by Andy Cutting. There are several people on Melnet who said it's tricky and inventive, and I don't think those two things are coincidences. I think it's inventive and that makes it tricky. It seems to me that it was written not for the melodeon, but just written as a good tune, which shows a lot of understanding about devices and structure. Again, I'm not saying that this is at all derivative or that these were necessarily the thought processes that Andy Cutting had when he was coming up with his tune. But I really like the tune and can't help myself but analyse why. First thing is it's in two parts, which we call binary form, and the constant challenge between two parts form is to have enough that's similar and enough that's different. It's in any composition, too much the same becomes boring and repetitive, and too much that's different becomes random and lacks cohesion, and this treads a nice balance between those two things. So the first thing that links it together is the rhythm, and rhythm is more important than we think. The rhythm of these two sections is, on the face of it, identical. This is the rhythm. In the first section it's, and the second section it's, which seems like exactly the same rhythm. So that's the unifying factor between the two sections, the rhythm. However, if we look at the function of the rhythm, the first section is subtly different. It starts with an upbeat, but after that point, the function of the last three notes in each bar is another upbeat. In fact, if I leave out the repeated notes, if I don't play that note, you can hear the upbeat intention. So the repetition of the note adds the unity between the two sections, but it's handled. It's very light. It's not a very heavy repetition. So it's not. But. So although it's the same rhythm, it's handled very differently. In the second section, that rhythm is very much stronger, 1, 2 and 3, and because it's sketching out the chord. So the second beat is strong in the second section. So although it seems on paper that the rhythm's the same, bum, ba 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 bum, ba 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 ba, or the actual function of those rhythms and the way they're handled by the player is very, very different. So that's really clever stuff. Whether or not it was conscious is a different issue. So they're rhythmically united. Now I'm going to look at the melody and the harmony together. This starts with an upbeat. Just do re mi. But there's a reason for that in this case. If a novelist tells you something at the beginning of a story, there's not surprising later on in the story that little nugget of information becomes very important, and that's what happens in this piece. That seems like a little throwaway upbeat, but it's really important later. Secondly, if we look at the first three bars, they're pretty much identical. Yes, the first note is on the third of the chord, and then after that we're on the root of the chord. Well, that third becomes important later. It's a nice bright sound to start with, but it becomes important later. It is effectively the same thing though. whenever you have a static melody, that frees up something else to change. Now we could change chord here. But it's better if we just change the bass note. Now if we look later on in the tune, the chords that go with that are F, C, D minor, and we can see we've got a little descending bass line going on. Well, if we work backwards, we can add that bass line right at the beginning. So if we keep a C major chord and just change the bass note, now move to an F major chord but still change the bass note, back to C major, to D minor, then we have a quick G C. So we've got a descending bass line, and then 5-1. Now whether or not that bass line is played like that, it's implied, I think, by the shape of the melody later on, this melody here. So we can use that information to hear it even if we don't play it earlier on. So here is very slowly that figure with a descending bass line without the changing chords. That section, more or less. So the repetitiveness of the melody leads us open to have something that changes. In this case, I suggest that if the chords stay the same as much as they can, then the bass line is free to move, and we hear that even if we don't play it, obviously. Secondly, it works well because they're really balanced phrases. We have the repetition, and we escape the repetition now. Now we have the repetition again, but in a descending sequence. Almost in an exact sequence. It's not quite exact, but that over the bass line gives us lovely tenths as well. Which is really strong. So repetition and then use of sequence gives us variety, which means we have balanced phrases in the first 4 and the second 4 bars. So the opening section works well. Strong rhythm, good use of an upbeat, ending on the 3rd, which becomes important later on, tying the whole thing together. Descending bass line, melody and bass line working together works really nicely. Second section, we would expect to have some contrast. Normally you might have it in a different tonality, so it might be minor rather than major, or more energetic, or something different about it. This one we start off in C again. But the implied bass line at the beginning is now actually in the tune itself. The C to B to A. Which is really clever, and actually that means that this time the chords do change because it's in the melody. The function of the notes here is just to sketch out the chord. So C major, E minor, A minor. So first of all, we have contrast because we have more frequent use of minor chords here, so there is a tonality change even though we don't start with that. We have major, minor, minor, so heavier use of minor chords. Secondly, that upbeat right at the beginning, notes 1, 2, 3 of the scale, he inverts here as the upbeat. So end of the last phrase of the A section. so that upbeat is, we're reminded of it here in its inversion. That's clever enough in itself, but as the piece, as the second section progresses, we see that that upbeat becomes even more important because we are about to modulate. Here's the second section: C major, E minor, A minor, G. Here it comes again. Here's the original upbeat. Remember we had, now we have it again, but on that's called the third of the chord, which is the mediant. And there's something lovely called a mediant fixation, which Schubert uses a lot. If we think of that mediant no longer as the third note of the chord C major, but as the root of a new chord, that suddenly comes to life. So we've had E minor, A minor, G. We expect C here, but what we get is E major. And that's real class. So we have the original upbeat, which always heralded as something important about to come. Here's the reason for that upbeat. It allows us to modulate. And again, just like the second section starts with the sketching out the chords, this modulation sketches out the new chord. Second bar of this new phrase fills in the notes of the arpeggio. So chord in an arpeggio shape, then we have scalic or stepwise movement, but if we look at it, it really is just the notes of A minor with the notes filled in, but it gives a nice shape, a little arch shape to the phrase. So going up by leap, coming down by step. That's clever enough. Now he does exactly the same thing, but on two new chords. So it's a sequence, and we have the same thing, but this time instead of an E major chord, we have a G major chord, which allows us to come back to three bars from the A section. And that's another really strong melodic compositional device, because that melody is so part of the A section that it leads us nicely back to the A section. So the rhythm's clever, it looks the same all the way through, but the impact or the function of the rhythm in the beginning is as upbeats. Whereas the second section, the rhythm is much squarer, even though it's identical on the page, and helps us sketch out the changing chords. By the way, in the second section, we've got a much faster harmonic rate, which means that we're changing chord every bar. Whereas in the beginning, we just had C major, admittedly over a descending bass line. So increased harmonic rate in the second section is always a good idea. Plus we've got that passing modulation, change of key, and the sequence, and then the melodic material from the first section. So a great tune with real insight into the compositional devices, and works well on the melodeon because of having to find ways around of those descending bass lines that add even more spice. So I will now try and find a melodeon and learn it on a melodeon.